What an introduction. I'm not sure how to interpret it except to say my CSIRO implant's been extracted and I've got the Ames one now on the other side. But what I'd like to talk about today is something that I get confronted with quite a lot as I do move around a bit around Australia, mainly dealing with both government but also industry in terms of actionable knowledge. I'll make an apology. I should never make an apology at the start of a talk, but I'll make one apology because this required delving into the literature around the science policy interface, and so a couple of the early slides are very wordy. It's simply because I don't have the current confidence to summarise them any further, but as we proceed through, the summaries get finer. What I would like to, well, I don't, this audience knows that, you know, Australia, and this talk will be about Australia, so we've heard a lot about some of the offshore, but I'm focusing on some of the issues around Australia this morning. This talk this audience doesn't need to be told that you know, we have a lot of coral reefs. They're incredibly important, they're incredibly beautiful, they're incredibly valuable from both an ecological but a social, cultural, economic sense. And we've heard a lot about that this morning, we've heard a lot about that yesterday, so there's no need. And I'll get this right, Malcolm, I swear I wouldn't make the same mistakes as Malcolm, but clearly I am a follower. And they are very beautiful places, and I think their iconic values, you know, is you know, indisputable, and they're things that will be damned if by the end of when I die and when you die, if they're not there. So in this talk, I'd really like to do a little bit of scene setting about the science policy interface. I'd like to talk a little bit about the Australian situation. I'll use a little different example. I thought, having attended the last conference and heard yesterday, I thought I'd take you into an industry example, just because I don't think many people around this audience work with industry much. And I'll then talk a little bit about managing for resilience, which is a term that's cropping up more and more in the coral reef world these days, both in Australia and internationally, and then come up with some summary and some suggestions. Scene setting. So here's some. I thought the Governor's introduction on yesterday did set the scene. I thought she made some three really interesting points. I thought the one was that she cautioned us, guided us, advised us about engaging with all interest groups and stakeholders, and I think we need to ask the question whether we really do that effectively. She also said that we need to convey understanding, but it's more than that. We need to convey what must be done to secure the future. She talked about we need to convey the reasons why it must be done. And I'd add another one. I think we need to be able to clearly monitor not only why we're doing it, but the effectiveness of action, be it management action or whatever. And I thought the other point that she made, and I think she did use the term the final frontier, and that's drawing, and I can understand it, noting her background in diplomacy and in trade diplomacy, is linking good science and good policy, but noted that we're a long way from achieving it, but it's essential if we really are going to have sustainable development policies, actions, management, and I think that's really good. The other little bit of scene setting, in another hat I wear as the chair of what's called the International Scientific Steering Committee of the Census of Marine Life, which is a global program about marine biodiversity. I get exposed to US Senate hearings, and I always like this guy's comment, John Brady, who said, everything has been said, but not everyone has had a chance to say it. And I wonder, and he said that in the context of Senate hearings, but I think sometimes I think we should think about that in the context of scientific meetings, and I'd say that nearly everyone has heard about the woes of coral reefs in recent years. I'm not sure everybody's heard much about, well, what we should be doing about it, except in the really general sense. So I'd make that observation, I think. And I think that points to a challenge, and it points to the challenge that the Governor highlighted yesterday in her introductory comments about the effective use of science to inform policy making and management action. I think also as coral reef scientists, we tend to make the assumption that that's a given and that's something that just happens. It's a linear relationship. I'm not sure we're making the right assumptions there. And here's one of those wordy slides, but I'll just quickly whip through it. I think the thing we need to remember that there's the use of the word of evidence-based policy is broadly used from our Prime Minister down to many people now. It's meant to be the basis of the future. And in some ways it's uncontroversial until you delve into the policy science interface literature, and you see there's a fair bit of controversy about that. There's quite a bit of controversy about, really can research provide the objective answers to policy questions, and whether policy making can become a more rational process. And I think there's quite a debate going on in the policy world about that. There's a push. Some people are saying, well, science may raise new questions, and that's what we do well, rather than, but it struggles with providing tractable and answers. It also is very good at providing contradictory views, and the viewers in some policy will say that leads to confusion, and that hence leads us to a much higher risk of that sort of the word of political or economic interests prevailing in the debate. There's also that a lot of people are saying that the use of the word of evidence-based should be used with great care, and probably it's more sensible, more appropriate to start thinking about evidence-informed, evidence-aware. Now, that probably sounds like a fairly nuanced argument, but actually when you delve in, it's not too nuanced at all. It leads to quite fundamental different outcomes. So I just put that up because I think it's something I think we should be aware of, that we shouldn't just assume that evidence-based policy is the way of the world into the future. Not sure it's even the way of the world at the moment. So science and policy, but again, if you look at that literature, I think it's a reasonable thing to say that there is a general view and a general recognition amongst the policymakers, amongst managers, and we've heard a lot of that today. We heard in the previous talk in terms of that policies and decisions are far better if they're appropriately informed. Seems pretty smart to me, but both are formed about the natural and also social systems. And there's also a bit of guidance around about how you might do that. Some of the areas where we're sort of not meeting the mark, and one is in around the stronger interplay between science and policy early in the process rather than at the results stage. There's certainly an issue of access to experts, access to research data and knowledge, and I think we're particularly poor at that, particularly in the ecological end of the spectrum. We're not willing to make our data easily available often. I think that's quite different to other communities, very different to the astronomical community, for example, very different to the genetic community, and even somewhat different to the oceanographic community that's a body closer to us. Where I think there's also the need, it's a bit like when you're putting so-called multi-disciplinary teams together, the essential success of those teams is when you have those people who can work across disciplines, the interpreters, and I think that also applies to this science policy interface. So people who actually can seamlessly move across that are rare, and I think are needed. And I'd also I think there's a comment back to the policy world too. I think they've got to become much clearer about their questions and much clearer about their needs. And so they've got to become a much better customer of science, and they've got to show a lot more pull on science rather than a collector of what's given. So to me, that's about as far as I've got in this world, but I think it's an area that we need to really think about, and I put that as a contextual situation. But I also think that there's another bit of scene setting we need to think about, and that's about the limits of knowledge and the culture of science. I'm not sure we talk to many people. My comments, I tend to think we talk to ourselves. And I wonder whether we've got that right. And that's not to underplay some of the really important actions going on. I think, for example, tonight's event is one of those really important actions. But I think, again, as a community, we need to think about, and remember, we are a minority group, we are a subculture, so we shouldn't pretend that many others listen to us. And I think and as a minority group, we tend to be the same. I think as a cultural group, I think there's tend to be the same, and I think we work in an area of Western science. Possibly others would disagree with this, but I particularly think it's a product of Catholic monasteries if you go back far enough. And And a bloke named Jesse Ossabel comes up with this comment quite often, which I agree with, that is that a lot of international conferences are, it's very similar to the gatherings of Benedictine monks in the past, where we confuse coming from different places with diversity. So I think the question I'd ask there, and I think the question I would pose, how can we recognise our own profound and pervasive biases and access the knowledge of those whose cultures or frames of reference are different to ours, or rather than just reject them. So again, I think that's another bit of scene setting, and I'm happy to have a discussion about all those later. I'm sure there will be. But what about the Australian situation? Now I'm going to go into even more dangerous grounds, because I'm going to do something. First thing, I'm going to summarise what we know about Australian coral reefs in one slide, and what we don't know. So I think, basically I think we know where they are, and we know where they've come, where they were in the past. I think we have some pretty good process understanding for some places. I think we know there's a lot of things live on coral reefs and their associated systems. We know most of them aren't corals. We have good knowledge about corals, fish, and probably a few of the molluscs. We're very good at documenting what's happening in coral reefs in terms of their declines, and knowing why. Some of the threats, particularly overfishing, water quality, climate change, ongoing debate about relative importance, except I think there's a general agreement about that sort of the big gorilla in the corner called climate change impacts in terms of sitting over it. But I think there's some also knowable, and I left the other key bit of, because I couldn't fit it on the slide, dynamic to this, what I'd call the unknowable, but we also should remember there will always be a lot of things critical to management and policy that is unknowable and needs to be incorporated into the process. But I think the knowable, so the challenges for us is, what about all those other species? Is it 1 million, is it 10 million? How many of those are important, or how many do we decide are important? How many of them are depend on healthy coral reefs? How coral reefs will respond. I think that's a really exciting area of work going on at the moment to threats, and particularly some of the big global threats. Functional roles and connectivity, again, it's tremendous work, but I think we're lacking information. And I think most importantly, if you agree that the real nirvana or the real goal of science is predictive capacity, our capacity to forecast, then I think we are finding it difficult to predict. And we struggle to predict 10 to 20 years into the future. We can sort of make some grand statements about 100 years and 1,000 years, but if we get down to the 5, 10, 15, 20-year horizons, I think we're still struggling. And as a consequence of some of our non-climate activities, and we all know that this is all amplified under all climate change scenarios, which we've heard yesterday, and of course, just in case I forget to say it later on, I think one of our biggest challenges for everyone is to stabilise and reduce CO2. I don't think that's, again, it's one of the major issues. But the thing I'd pose in terms of our knowledge, of all our knowledge, how much is actionable? How much would if you were given the job of actually managing a coral reef, or managing the Great Barrier Reef, or managing the Kimberley coasts, or managing the Scott Reef systems, or the Ningaloo Reef systems, how would you use that information? How could you use that information easily? So I think that's a question we should be asking ourselves, as well as asking the policy and managers people to more clearly define what they want. And I look at my mate Dave Wackenfeld down there. So what's happening in Australia? I think there's no doubt that we have the healthiest and best managed coral reefs in the globe, and I think we can take a fair bit of credit for that, but I also think we should all remember there's a fair bit of demography in there. 21 million people is not many people for the geographical area. When you look at the demographics of the coral reef systems in Australia, and I'll illustrate that in a moment. I think we're policy rich but implementation poor. I think we are very good at doing policies, and I don't mean that as a criticism. I think we're very good at setting plans, be it reef water quality plans or whatever, and policies around marine protected areas and so forth. But I think at times we struggle with implementation. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. Of course, implementation is not cheap, and building on I think Terry's introduction this morning, implementation is often very complex because it's that social, natural interface, and it's just bloody hard, So, but I think there's So I'd say policy rich, implementation poor. Science, we're global leaders in coral reef science, and I think the work we've heard today and yesterday illustrates that quite dramatically in terms of the in the work of the centre and other, not to mention all the other organisations in Australia. I think the other strength Australia has, which we haven't heard a lot about, but we may hear a little bit later when Hugh's talk, but I think Australia is also, and I think we recognise, a global leader in development of policy management tools, and I'd point to two that I think are particularly useful, and I think some of Hugh's Possingham's, and I can go into that, because I assume Hugh will talk about it later, tools, but also, and again, Tony Smith's and Beth Fulton's Atlantis model in terms of actually how you might bridge between science and policy in a modelling context, which I think is some of the most fantastic. But again, I don't think it's used much or even been considered much in the coral reef world. And it's also a nice segue into the management action. I think we do have some major impediments and weaknesses, and I think at times we do delude ourselves about our level of knowledge, because I think there is a lack of basic knowledge, including, and I would argue most importantly, for most of our systems, we don't have what I would call routine monitoring of the reef systems linked quite clearly to agreed coral reef health indicators. I think Rumpa may argue with me about that, but I'm not sure. I don't think we have that. Until we have that, I think all the sort of monitoring you'll struggle with it. And then I'd ask the question, is there effective use of science and informed policy making and management at the moment in Australia? Probably not. Now, I'll try and justify some of those statements with a couple of quick examples, but before that, I just, on the positive side, from an institutional and a governance perspective, we're very strong. You know, we're unusually strong, even compared to other development countries, in terms of how we span across what I'd call the science dimensions of, incremental innovations, transformational technology and whole of system solutions, from strategic research, applied research, through to policies and programs. So in a sense, we have the institutions in place, and most of those institutions are underpinned by very good governance. So again, that's one of our strengths. I'm not sure they're well linked though. And I would also, to justify my comment earlier, I think we are the lucky country, and I draw on a bit of old data here, and I apologise for that, but because you'll see in the two slides from here why. I mean, this is the old done 96, which is basically just Earth's luminosity at 1996. It shows where the lights are on, and it's not surprising. You can see the US there, you can see Europe there, you can see Japan there. Can't see Australia, can't see much else. If you actually do the simple analysis and say, well, what would it look like if everyone lit the world like they do in the US, use that as the base, saying that's what it would look like, not surprising, China, India and so forth. Then if you do and that's why I had to use the 96 data, because I haven't done the update. If you look at the difference, you can see that things are going to change quite dramatically, but not much in Australia when you forecast. Unlikely, and that's probably reasonable. Also explains why we've got so much commodity shipping north to those two big red blobs up there, which is a bit of a segue. So I think one of our strengths is our population size and the relatively slow growth in that, but I think it's also something we need to be aware of when we're thinking about our performance in terms of managing and developing policies to support the long-term health of coral reefs. So then, again, an attempt to justify, I'd like to take you now to the northwest of Australia. I'd like to take you into big industry, one of Australia's largest developing industries, likely to be an area that Australia will take a leadership role if you believe the mining companies. That's offshore LNG. We have massive resources. This is even now out of date, particularly in the northwest. If you remember that last slide of those big blobs called China and India, extremely well placed in terms of proximity, in terms of shipping the stuff up. Remembering LNG is a strange commodity. Unlike coal, unlike iron ore, and that you can't store it, so you've got to get it out of once you've got it out of the ground, you've got to get rid of it. You can't store it. But there's significant, and a fair bit of it, even taking into account the coal seam developments in Queensland, is offshore. We heard yesterday from a little bit from Malcolm's talk about there is an argument about LNG as being part of the carbon solution, certainly in the interim. Some argue if it's not delivered in the next 30 years, it's not going to be part of that solution. So whether you believe that debate or is another thing, but what you can say is that certainly compared to oil and coal from both a power generation emissions and also from an extraction process and transporting emissions, it's a fair bit less than both those other commodities. So there is an argument that it is part of our general solution, but it also needs to be part of the, that needs to be done quickly. Scott Reef's a place up in the northwest. It's also a place of a lot of beautiful coral reefs. We know a bit about those coral reefs, very similar to the Great Barrier Reef in terms of bleaching, cyclones and so forth. About recruitment, we know a bit about fish. But when you actually look at, go and look at the industry figures and the forecast figures in terms of how much the extraction of those coral reefs, the extraction of that LNG, you look at we completely fail in terms of meeting the projected targets of development. And actually, there's only been two offshore LNG projects come to production since 1979. On that rate, hardly any will. And there's 4 reasons for that: approval delays, skill shortages, capacity and joint venture dynamics. Forget about the last 3, I just want to talk about approval delays. And one of the things when you look at why, and I'll use this as the Scott Reef project itself, basically when you actually look at the timelines around resource identification through to operations, and you look at the science and advice required to proceed along that timeline, the one area we're completely failing in, and by we I mean everybody, is that the very good policy and regulatory environment, both at a state and Commonwealth level, makes a fundamental assumption that we actually know something about the system knowledge. And you actually find that the system knowledge bit of science has never been done. So then you get into all sorts of debates late on around approvals, leading to quite conservative decision making, leading to very slow decision making, leading to costs to both industry and government and to general society. So I use that. And I would argue, though I noticed my chairman has stood up, so I better speed up. You can make I think you can make the same sort of argument around some of the more public good issues, and this one in terms of we've done it for acidification in the Great Barrier Reef. Just into saying that we're very fixated we're very focused on the understanding end of the spectrum area and not really getting past. And if you actually look at the timelines, we won't have the knowledge, actionable knowledge, to deliver in the timelines required. So I was going to just quickly, I'll skip through these. I just wanted to come back to managing for resilience. We talk about that, and I won't define it, but I think that's I tried to define it there. I took a definition anyway, but again, I think one of the things that it also assumes is that we have a basic system knowledge and a routine collection of long-term data linked to indicators, and we don't. So again, I would also think that this whole concept of resilience, fine objective in itself, but until we do that, I think we'll struggle with it. It's not all bad, and I think we do have some good examples of long-term data. I'll pick some from my own institution, be it the LTMP, where we've got, over 20 years of data on corals at fairly fine scales. Similarly, you've got the water quality stuff, which is a consortium, including in my own institution. We have there for the we also have that linked to some preliminary work about identifying potential indicators if you want to focus on biodiversity. There's some fair bit of work about, you can look at where areas have been exceedance of guideline values, where you might want to focus activity. So, and then there are also some work looking at the interaction between water quality and climate, which again I think illustrates some of this need to get this integration, and that work suggesting that there is an interplay between managing water quality and resilience and buying time for the corals to respond. And then I think at a more general scale, we do have the development and implementation of the Integrated Marine Observing System for Australia, including a Great Barrier Reef node and an emerging node across the north. And again, I think as a coral reef community, we need to get more engaged with that, because I think it can deliver some of the routine, near real-time and real-time data to actually aid not only in the science but also the policy and implementation process. So, last slide. In summary, I think if we really are going to manage for resilience and make that connection to management and policy, then I think we need to think about where we accept that the system understanding is inadequate, and so there is a very strong case for science, but I think we need to be very clear about the science priorities. I think the lack of long-term, what I'd call routine, near real-time or real-time data is a major issue for us, but it's got to be linked to agreed indicators. That is a major issue. And I think in terms of we need to think more seriously about how engagement into the policy and management world, and I think I won't go through them, those 4 points I mentioned earlier around the early engagement in research, the access to information and people, interpreters, and then encouraging the policy to be a bit more clear about their questions, I think is probably the good way to go. Thanks to my colleagues, stole a lot of their information and data, so thanks to them for the help. And I'll just take 30 seconds. I just want to make one comment, one ad. AIMS has got some cash to build what's called a Tropical Ocean Simulator. It's a very large, high-volume facility to do large-scale, long-term experimentation. It's a major facility. It's an international and national facility, and we'll be seeking guidance from the community about the sorts of things they might want to do in this. And David Mead and Lyndon Llewellyn will be visiting, but if anybody's interested, please contact us. So thank you.